d- a use case agnostic definition that supports the appropriate uses across country. I think one of the sub goals may be to periodically take a look at what extensions people have had to add, like we did with the BC extensions a few months ago, and evaluate those and see if those are localized needs or things that might be necessarily generally. The example I have in my head right now is that BC's talking about how they're handling rostering and paneling and associating a client with a physician. There's really nothing in the FHIR spec around that. It's all extension space. So there may be a point where we need to look at, how we're handling those kinds of things and trying to at least be somewhat consistent in how we approach them.
And so if I may though, also, basically from an HL7 perspective, and I mean this both HL7 Canada, but also HL7 International, there is an absolute recognition, and there was right from the outset with the establishment of FHIR, especially with the so-called 80-20 principle, right, which is to focus on core things, is that there would be review of extensions as they arose from whatever source. Those sources could be in the affiliates, it could be in individual projects. From whatever source, it became apparent that, oh, there's this extension that's being used, it's being consistently used. It seems to be addressing the fact that there is something missing in the definition of this concept of patient, for example, or whatever it is. And that could be, again, jurisdictions would face this problem with individual projects. Certainly at a national level, vendors would care to know that, the thing that they're doing, if it's aligned with that definition, is going to be successful. And or if an extension is demonstrated to be consistently required in order to accomplish a function, that we then go back and look at the baseline definition. And
yes,
for that matter, to the resource itself.
Yeah, so that's my point, is we've been looking at consistency in terms of being able to conform to the base, but not very much at when we need to look at extensions and maybe share extensions. Frankly, associating a client with a doctor and what the status of that association is doesn't sound to me like it's in the 20%, but that's just me.
Let's talk. So actually, I think that was one of the key themes I wanted to talk through today.
Yeah.
So what I'm gonna do, I've copied over the content from last time. Actually, this was a statement that I think Paul Knapp made last time, which was that, for us to play in the space where we do want to be the higher up in the hierarchy and true derivation to occur, we need to have this use case agnosticism, and that we have a challenge in some of our constraints today. And so the theme I kind of want to drill into is are we wanting to include in some of these conditions, if we are expecting to play this role where, for instance, we're asking a CA core or another national guide to base off of, or to include us in their chain, is what I'll say. Do we need to take a more rigid look at how we're applying this use case agnosticism role? Because if we choose an alternative method, you are kind of informally aligned, it may require less rigidity than this more formal derivation pattern, which requires a very substantial lens here, where we go back and say, okay, beyond the GDR, I think, like Lorraine had put it, we have to start examining these and also look at extensions and our stance towards them. I think, Lorraine, you were saying them more from the standpoint of what do we socialize, but I think the second, or the flip side of that coin, is also what's the impact of us socializing a bunch of extensions optionally if our expectation is that we're going to be somewhere up in the chain of derivation. Did Paul's statement about that we might not be at this place of true use case agnosticism like ring true for anyone on the call, or like, does anyone feel like that isn't the case?
Well, I think it's hard to be purely use case agnostic. I think we're close because I don't think we've actually really developed the baseline profiles in the context of a use case. We've somewhat done it because of the reality of, anyone who's doing the work is coming at it from the perspective of the work that they're involved in. So you get influenced by specific use cases, just as a matter of reality.
From another perspective, you could argue that every single thing we've built here has a specific use case in mind, and that is that we're using this in Canada.
Yeah, it depends on how narrowly you're defining use cases, I guess.
And I
And
think
that would be the limit of it. I think that we should have.
I would agree. And to Paul's, so I just wanted to speak to Paul's comment. Paul's concern, as he expressed in that comment, is that, when you have a conceptual thing, if you start constraining it in the absence of a use case, you may inhibit its ability to be used effectively in various use cases because you presumed to understand what that constraint should be when in fact it just wasn't anticipated or it hasn't come up yet, sort of thing. This is the risk. Having said that, back to what Randy's saying, is that there are some aspects of our characterization of a patient or a service or a provider in Canada that we could generalize and say, this seems to be very consistent across the country. We'd be surprised if it wasn't. Now, here's the benefit of this in terms of a baseline. If in the course of actually doing use cases based upon the baseline, you find out that's not the case, then you change it, right? So the baseline is something that's not immutable. It needs to be as constant as possible, but it needs to always stand up to review. So, for example, when Alexander from Netherlands was talking about what they did when they used the term core, what he was describing was exactly that kind of rigor in a process where they look at things as they come along. They have a set of assumptions, but if those assumptions change, then they go back and they re-examine that there is a sort of a foundational definition that they're using as part of what they call core that serves this purpose. So my personal take on this
has done that because we've brought forward changes and we've evaluated them and decided whether to accept them or not.
Yeah. The other comment I want to make is that in terms of a baseline, what you may want to be addressing is avoiding the risk that vendors, and I think FHIR is very susceptible to this, by the way. It's very susceptible to startups or new people coming on the scene and saying, hey, I've got this great idea, I want to do this thing. And if you want to be absolutely sure that they don't use resources improperly in a Canadian context, that's another real good reason to say, listen, if you go with the baseline, you're going to be safe in that you're not going to do something inappropriate. Right. So that's another concept. Now, I can't put concrete examples to that because I'm not working at that level, but that's a typical kind of problem as well that I've faced in my own past in terms of systems development, is people assuming they can do things with that sort of base definition that they should not. Doesn't mean they can't, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. So that's another feature of a baseline concept.
You mean like direct use?
Well, no, I mean in the sense that what the baseline does is if someone who's unfamiliar with healthcare, for example, starts making assumptions around what the nature of some of the elements are defined for a patient profile and starts using them inappropriately, that's not a good thing, right? In other words, they're going to have trouble with their consistency. It won't be transferable. If there's ways in the baseline, and maybe we won't hit this, but if there's ways in the baseline that we can help qualify that in terms of the use of the FHIR resource patient in terms of our understanding of how it works in Canada. This may not be the best example, by the way, but that's the idea anyway.
I can provide you a perfect example, Ron.
Okay.
Okay. The care team resource in FHIR is by definition explicitly defined to talk about the set of people who take care of a patient, from a nutritionist to their physician to their, informal care provider at home. It's all patient-centric. A lot of our jurisdictions think of a care team as an organization of care providers who do some sort of set of care. The care team resource actually will let you define either of those things, right? So the question is, if you end up using the care team resource for a use case that it wasn't really designed for, even though the technical underpinnings will allow you to, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right. So that's the kind of example I think you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Is that something that falls within, I mean, like, I know we have these goals around consistency in the marketplace through kind of proliferation of common concepts, but I think, like, to me, it seems like that goes beyond, right? That, like, yes, we do provide an educational opportunity for many that are interacting with our spec and community. But, like, I think providing guidance on proper use, like, that might float the line a bit.
Okay, I'll defer to that for sure. But anyway, just trying to make a case for the fact that, there's value in definition of concepts if in that definition you're not flirting with that line. And again, we should always be asking that question, whatever we're doing with the baseline. But I think there is still very strong value in that. In particular, if what we want ideally, and this is the thing that's eluded us in Canada, and I feel this with great, shall I say, sensitivity, since when I was doing the UHRS blueprint work for InfoAg, it was very frustrating to me that there was this lack of consistency across the line, and the vendors initially were all for that consistency, but once they realized it wasn't forthcoming, well, they just sort of gave up. I mean, what they would do is they would just say, okay, our product is the consistency. We're going to stick with that. And at which point, I generally did have jurisdictions coming back to me and saying, well, I don't know why we should adhere to this run, because if we do adhere to it, the vendor's just going to tell us, no, you're going to use our thing, right? So there's this dynamic between what we're defining in terms of a way that a vendor could then approach their market more broadly with less customization, and the absence of that kind of that presence of a thing, meaning, well, there's no way to know what would be reusable, so therefore we'll start using our product definition as the reusable thing. And again, that's not a healthy situation either.
So, like, with that lens, if like the current course of maintaining or I should say the current course of attempting use case agnosticism as the baseline requires, like, a constant refinement that is more and more folks bring up, hey, this doesn't what I have modeled, and I don't need this constraint that you've applied. The alternative, like, if we had gone about this a slightly different way, like, I don't know if we would have as many outstanding potential changes that are coming down the pipeline had we taken an approach that was more aligned to what we're seeing in bases today, which is, like, primarily a handful of constraints on things like identifier and in some cases preferred value sets, but very uncommonly, like, any slicing or modeling. And part of, I think I'll pull up, I think I've got it in this, when Ron has been talking about what Alexander Henkett from the Netherlands has brought up, is they're trying to kind of show how they do their own framework on like the most abstract profiles that just communicate those layers, right? There's no must supports, right? Like, as you go further down, you may see slicing start to be introduced. And, once you get to the more closed modeling pieces, you start to see must support and cardinality constraints introduced. But we don't look like this, right? Like, we are some mixture down here that makes it challenging for us to say, but derive from us at this stage. And so we have we have a hard path and we have an easier path in front of us. The hard path is keep these constraints and wait till someone raises their hands and continue like working for this governance process that will allow us to do that in a more transparent manner. But the easier path is really, really look at where we put constraints and consider removing them, because it will make it easier for guides to then feel comfortable at this stage putting us up in the hierarchy and like formally including us in their inheritance.
Yeah, that's the easy path. Well, the challenge is again the issue of consistency from transferability of systems that use a particular implementation guide, and or the actual transferability of the guides themselves, when in the case that you might want to reuse one rather than build or roll your own. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, my viewpoint on it is, as I say, architectural, and how shall I say this? From an architectural perspective, in terms of the things that I've learned in my career, I tend to try and hold those principles, hold a high bar for them, as long as I possibly can. Now, reality may prevail against that in terms of what actually has to occur, but if you know a thing is sort of quote unquote the right thing to do, and then I aspire to do that. But I think in either case, you're still going to find yourself in a situation where we need some kind of governance construct within which we can identify something that needs to be changed because we've encountered something that we had not anticipated.
Well, and one of the challenges, I think, is as we all try to work on promoting and moving these processes forward, is in our jurisdictions, we're all trying to work, we're trying to eat a different piece of the elephant.
Yeah.
So having a way to coordinate those things, right? For provider registry, Ontario's PPR tackled a different part of the problem than BC's PLR did. The same kind of thing is happening in healthcare services and stuff right now, although I think Ontario is moving forward with some internal work. So making sure that, as we work on those different pieces of the elephant, that we have a way to communicate and coordinate so that we're not contradicting each other. We may still have slightly different requirements, but we want sort of a consistent base so that we can collaborate and exchange. And we don't really have that forum right now. I mean, a little bit of it comes up on the quarterly implementers call. But I think that's a gap.
And I think the gap will become much more evident as the utilization of FHIR increases across the country.
Yes, and because the quarterly implementers call is focused on the implementation level, not the business coordination level. We're missing that higher level.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right.
Now, every once in a while, we hear about something that each other's doing, and we set up a call when we get on a call to collaborate between provinces. But that's informal and ad hoc.
Exactly.
This is the challenge I see if we go to that extreme of saying we don't have any constraints in there, because then it starts becoming, what are we really providing as a baseline here? I mean, if we don't at least say these are the minimum things we think we're using in Canada, which again is adaptable if we need to, because we're not always going to be right. If we don't have that, what point is it even existing for this thing?
Well, yeah, Randy, the question then is, why don't you just go to the FHIR baseline?
Exactly.
Now,
FHIR resources themselves.
Yeah, all the base FHIR resources in the core.
Yeah.
Now, and I think there are some places where we definitely need some constraints. One of the most important ones is probably value sets.
Yes.
And we
So-
don't have a heavy constraint, like, so you're saying like continuing our approach to pointing people in the preferred direction of value sets.
I think that, my perspective on that one right from the outset is that, Canada, in terms of the various purposes that we have, in terms of even, for example, the provision of snowmed licensing and the way that length has been dealt with, and PCLOD, I think that, there's benefit in doing it. I think what we're lacking is process and governance around being able to do the monitoring. How, so we don't have a process for raising the flag when someone says, hey, you guys said this, I've got this use case, how do we do it? But right now that is happening ad hoc, hopefully in an informed way, but not everyone is at our table. And we're not at other tables. Right?
Well, yeah, and we need to, so there in particular, we need to differentiate between the base and the use case specific. Because I'm thinking of a conversation I had, I forget which of the Canadian calls it was on, around the value set for condition codes for problem lists.
Right.
And the conversation we had was around, well, someone in the team thought it should be much narrower, and I thought it should be broader. And it finally came up as we went through the discussions. It's because the patient summary needed a narrower value set, and the broader constituency needed a broader one. So we probably needed two value sets, right? One for, patient summary needed a value set for what they needed. And then we needed to keep the existing value set broad enough to cover the other use cases. And it's those kinds of conversations that we need to keep having.
I mean, and so let me ask again. So I know that Sheridan, you and Mike had diligently been working towards obtaining some consensus through consultation. And I think that's part of your question here today, right? Is what's our best path forward in terms of doing this to allow organizations and or individuals to say, yeah, that's the thing, I want that, I want that approach, or I want that consistency. Naturally, of course, the questions are, okay, so what are we going to do? If I need that consistency, how can I be confident that I'll get it? In terms of what's happening in the Canadian space. And again, we have some vendor representation, but I don't think a pitch has been made. And again, my experience with vendors goes back to, listen, it's not my job to herd those cats. Somebody's got to herd those cats. I wish you would herd those cats, because then it would make my capacity to approach a market in Canada that much easier. But they're not confident that that can occur. So it becomes the Wild West again.
And so you're saying, like, what we're trying to do is to reflect, I think, the end state of the relationships between the base that still provides value, like in some of these spaces around terminology.
Yeah.
But it can't be dependent. Like I don't think that we can fall back on our degree of confidence when defining where we should fit, right? Like, I think, like, okay, if we go through the thought exercise of, we took this path, right, to align to the approach that we're seeing in other places and be more like a base. If we had a similarly use case agnostic guide come into play that still had all of our prior constraints that we felt were appropriate and use case agnostic, but we didn't have the rigidity of process in play yet, and then further, let's say, added further expectations, like what we had always wanted in a core. If we're talking about that as a potential ecosystem that we would live in, like, I don't think we can say, or maybe I don't think we should say, we shouldn't take this path because, oh, that's never going to happen. right? I think we
Right.
at least have to
Right.
explore, like, what's our best case scenario here, and then try to promote that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do. The thing that we need is responsiveness in the case of, and well, one is responsiveness, but the other is how do we detect when we need to respond to something in terms of as a baseline. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
My worst nightmare
Uh,
here is diversion between the baseline and the core at the fundamental level. So if the patient profile defined in the Canadian patient summary is significantly different from the Canadian patient profile in the baseline, that's going to create huge challenges. Now, it may not be that. I don't know. But we're not right now coordinating between CA core and CA baseline.
So let's talk about that. So, like, let's say that the core fully subsumed the constraints, the must supports, the cardinality constraints, and potentially the terminology constraints that we have today. Is that a concern anymore? Or
Well,
is the concern if it's not a one-to-one?
I could see the core further concerning terminology, etc., and things like that. That might make sense, depending upon the use case.
Are you saying that if the CA baseline fully consumed that, or CA core fully consumed the baseline, that you would just then derive everything off of the core from that point forward?
Well, in that case, there wouldn't be any potential diversions. Right now, we're on a divergent path, and that's my worst nightmare: is that we get divergent views of things because we're not discussing across those initiatives. Because
specifying where they're really trying to go yet, but everything that's come out is kind of saying that that's the path they're heading towards, yet they're not building it. So that's where the question is, if they really want to intend that path to replace baseline or subsume it, they really have to make that their scope too, is to cover everything.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. So I don't know, is there a space here then on the easy path to assert a set of principles in terms of the utilization of things on, in that easy path, in terms of here are the principles behind how this is shaped, and here's what we're asking anyone that finds that that's, those assumptions are different to contribute back. I mean,
I think we have a bunch of that already for the baseline in terms of the principles, what should be in the baseline.
Yeah, I think so too. But I guess that's the question, is that sufficient? You know what, we don't, so here's the problem. We need any assumption we making, which may be plausible and reasonable, needs to be tested. And the only way it can be tested is if we start to see broader utilization, because we can't imagine all the scenarios within which this, might arise. So we have to allow those things to arise and then have a method for dealing with them, I think. But I think the easy path is
we've been doing that. Yeah, we've been doing that. We did that. They did the due diligence review around the then published implementation guides by various jurisdictions, and then as other jurisdictions come on, we've been taking change requests to this committee to adjust things, and evaluating them and saying yes or no. So I think the baseline team itself is on that path fairly successfully. The question is, though, we're a small piece of the community, and how do we ensure that we have both the community, broader community buy-in and validity, and connections with the other efforts that are going on nationally? I guess is the two things for me.
Mm-hmm. And there's bi-directional. I think that was another theme.
No, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So can I take this through programmatically? Because I do think that, like, the scope of the thing that is deriving from us matters. And I think if we have the opportunity, we should be able to say, okay, to try to describe the future, the places where we play well together, right? So if the CA baseline was replaced by, let's say, a CA core that was similarly use case agnostic, had all of the same constraints. If you woke up tomorrow and the CA baseline was made the CA core, then like, is there a concern other than the fact that maybe that we wouldn't have the same community conversations that we have today? Like, do we have that concern if it's a one-to-one, if they carried on the baseline under a different name?
Yeah. Go ahead, Laura.
If it was subsumed into CA core and I was confident that there was a mechanism for community input, then I would not have a concern. But I still have lack of confidence in that last piece.
What about
I
others?
agree.
Like, okay.
Lorraine.
And is there anything that we're not capturing as a input or consideration here? So I've got for community input. Sorry, guys, I know it's really small.
And by the way, Sheridan, like this is excellent work and is the sort of thing that any governance initiative in Canada regarding interoperability needs to engage with and consume, because what we're defining here are a set of requirements for process that are relevant to governance, right? Totally relevant to governance. So this is good work. I mean, figuring out, but also making a case for it is very, very important.
That's how we've done everything to this date, right? Like,
yeah.
Find out what we want and ask for it.
Yep. And so I think and I know those initiatives are early and underway, but I think that this is a really good place to be able to get a sense of what the implications are of making different choices. I'm with Lorraine. If I have confidence that wherever core is defined is representative, like it has the inherent characteristics of what's supposed to happen in a world where you have consensus, you have openness, you have managed processes, you have governance, you have ways like that I'm totally fine with. What you call it is really not relevant. What matters is that you have these capabilities to be able to strive for consistency and coherence, while at the same time having processes that help you to understand when, okay, yeah, we've got to step back and look at this again because there was something we had not anticipated in our previous definition, and then in a managed way, fix that.
So am I okay to because I just want to make sure. This is a theoretical exercise to try out these various differences. But when we're saying no concerns, we mean if it was renamed tomorrow, right? Effectively, the naming convention of baseline was changed and this was met. Yeah. Other than this passive the passive benefits we're receiving, there's not as much concern.
Yeah, I would have to say that, right?
Okay, so then
somebody else to me, so I want to make sure.
Well, I agree in principle with everything here, and I said that before. The one concern is I would have to see that the governance group of this Canada Core or whatever it is actually listening to input from the people like us, so that if you have discovered something, you come to them and they don't just immediately say, nope, we're not doing that, or they're immediately doing subgroup and ignoring another group kind of thing. We got to make sure that there's actually a sense that input is being considered and then responded to, not just lied through.
It's the difference between deterministic arriving at those things deterministically and doing them consensually, right? Through consensus. That's the difference. And consensus doesn't mean everybody absolutely agrees, but consensus does mean, and it's a very democratic concept, is that the majority and that majority has to have an appropriate distribution of interests, comes to a conclusion or is in support of something that doesn't give them a particular heartache. They may not have agreed with it, they may have had a preference, but at the same time it works for them, they can deal with it. That's fine. And that's the way that this is meant to be.
Every time we talk about this, I think of the work Jane Curry and you, Ron, did on the governance framework.
Yes.
Which was talking about how you make decisions across organizations where you don't have a hierarchy command control structure, and some organization can say thou must, right?
Well,
because
what you did,
that's
yeah,
the
Yeah.
environment we're in, right? I know sometimes InfoWay, I'm going to be blunt, acts as if they can say thou must. But the reality is the way our jurisdictions and stakeholders are structured, we are basically peers and need to
Yeah.
figure out a way we make decisions in the ecosystem that we're trying to cooperate in.
Yeah.
And that's what that governance framework was talking about, is how do you do that?
Yeah. The governance framework you're speaking of, this is while we were doing the SAFE work, right, Maureen?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So we might want to surface that. I think actually now would be a really good time to surface that because it applies anywhere. It was something that we did.
Yeah, it was just talking about how organizations cooperate to make decisions.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, I keep going back to, so if you look at the affiliate agreement for HL7 Canada, it has all of these characteristics in terms of behavior. And what I like about it, and what appeals to me, I mean, I've been doing stuff in HL7, mostly from an architecture perspective, for a very long time. And sometimes the experience can be a very frustrating one. But at the same time, one of the things I like about that process is because ANSI has requirements for the behavior of the entity called HL7. ANSI has the same requirements for any other entity, for whatever sector or domain they're working in, that has these exact characteristics associated with it from a governance perspective. And that's what I really, really like. The only other thing that I would really like to see us have in Canada for this purpose is there's a lot of weight associated with making a decision that commits governments, for example, to fund, you know, certain activities or to require in their tendering processes, things like that's difficult. One of the things that I see in certain countries, and we sort of have this in Canada, but I'm just not sure the health sector is connected into it, is that informed standards organizations that are using this kind of an open process, they don't get to decide, or they don't have the weight of authority to commit a thing. What they do, however, is make recommendations to such a body that does have the authority to make that commitment. And so does all these other organizations. And the key thing about that is that the governing body that makes that decision, it has the authority to make the decision, but also it doesn't have skin in any one of those games. You know what I mean? It has no skin in the game other than to assure that industry as well as public sector has that stable thing to hit when we talk about standardization. And of course there may be other adjunct things that come along, like, you know, underwriters labs who test for things, you know, based upon certain standards to be sure they're coherent, things like that. So I think, you know, I just, you know, my frustration here is that I think we need to move the governance process along, and this is a compelling business case, what we're discussing here today.
If we are considering, let's say, like we're working through this theoretical exercise, that the governance process in this future program ticked all the boxes, and let's just say that that's the constant. Like, I think that probably is going to be the constant of what is desired, regardless of where the baseline fits in here. So if we consider that a constant, and then we're looking at the variables that may change, do we feel the exact same way, which is if our current rules are fully consumed and the you know, the national guide that takes them over has a process in place that we desire, does any of that statement change if our current rules are contained, but also some of those additional desired constraints are layered on? Let's say it's still use case agnostic, but there are times where for instance, verification status was one of the things for condition that clinicians brought up and said, this would be really, really great. We think it's not for a particular use case, but it's probably something we want more consistency around.
Yeah.
Do we feel the same way? Is there something about the adding of additional constraints and expectations, as long as it's still use case agnostic, that changes our assessment of our comfortability retiring? Because it's kind of like it would be met and then some if the structure was in play.
Well, I think the addition of additional constraints, that kind of thing, if whatever structure, who's ever making the decisions, if it goes by the principles we've been talking about being sort of appropriate across the country and use case agnostic, and right, then it makes sense and doesn't really actually matter where we're applying them, provided we've had the consensus agreement process to evaluate those design principles. So if we're consistent with the design principles, then I think it's okay.
So that's an additional variable, right? Which is,
right.
Yeah, when extending, do they still follow through on the process of ensuring use case agnosticism?
Yes, and extensions are slightly different than constraints.
Sorry,
right?
yeah.
Because constraints limit people, extensions give people more options.
And so in this example, like using extended more like going beyond. So they may add more constraints, or in places where we said, man, we'd really like to flag this as a must support, but we just haven't seen consistency, or we found that 2 guides didn't have it.
Yeah.
But that through a program that was additive, but still met this use case agnostic rule.
Now, things like modifier extensions or must supports are things we always have to consider really carefully. For instance, on the BC address data structure, they have a validation flag for whether the address has been run through the Canada Post validator or not, and validated as the correct address. So there's an extension there that's optional. Other people may or may not want to use that, but it's not constraining people from using address as address.
Mm-hmm. Are there other considerations here, or like, do our feelings change in any way because of this piece if this and this are met, principles and process?
Randy, Elliot, others?
I think maybe we just think about the topic here. I might just share my thought here in my mind, and the question comes to my mind is, tell me the reason why we need to keep this baseline stay alive. That's the question, just in my mind. If we can answer the question, then we can maybe keep this baseline stay and thrive. And from that point, you might think about a different way. Just use a use case agnostic as one example. We can treat it as more like a business case here, and we treat have a provider and a user. If we sit in the user's case, we say, yeah, we're a provider. We build this FHIR baseline, but not target use case. But however, as a user, there's no any barricade to stop you using it for your use case. I just throw my, some thought here and see what kind of feature, what kind of function that the baseline can provide. Not to say, yes, you cannot do that, I will do that. Maybe that way, but however, in other ways, we will do this work for the customers. These are features. And on the other side, my thought is baseline might not, how to say that, have to see some kind of self-evolution here. And instead of say we will just focus, I heard actually folks here just talk about terminology here. And my words here, when we think about to revise the vision about this community, see well, maybe my wording is wrong, but just correct me. We are based on the FHIR standard, but is working for on this, how to say, sorry, is working on this interoperability oriented community. So which include pretty much three main streams: terminology, the exchange standard, and the data model. And from that point, but we still stay with the FHIR standard, but all those other, streams will be included. So from that point, we can start to have our conversation rolling and evolving, and then we will see some real feature benefit that uniquely could be provided by baseline. That's just my thoughts shared with the community. Thank you.
And
go
ahead.
I'll agree with you in the fact that we haven't really addressed the exchange and the dynamic pieces of some of this, or the interrelationships between resources, like when we talk about rostering and things. But I think we're already seeing benefit from being able to say, we can claim direct computable conformance to the Canadian patient profile or the Canadian practitioner profile. So if you're conformant to that, then you can be conformant to and submit to the information exchanges where, yes, we may have extended and discussed adaptations and discussed how we're using things. But if you send us a Canadian baseline patient, it still validates as a BC patient, for instance, right? Because we're directly conforming against the Canadian baseline. There's real benefit to that.
Thank you, but
yeah,
in short, because it's 1 o'clock already, I would put conformance at the last step. Right now, there's should be my perspective.
Yes, I
we
agree.
shouldn't talk about conformance until we have that really some real value and some really sustainable, profile can provide to the end users. Thank you.
And I think that like that isn't the natural progression of this conversation. Like, I think we have this last one to talk through around if it's adopted by a more a national guide, but that our scopes don't line up one-to-one. But like, if we end up in either of these two scenarios, I think that we still have to examine, like you said, like, what are the benefits? If you stripped away the fact that like our profiles encourage these rules to be consistent, we should be examining, are there other benefits that as a community make sense for us to continue, even if either of these two are met? And so I think for next time, that might make sense, like, to try to finish this off and then to talk through this. I'm calling them passive benefits, but they may be more active, or they may be only semi-realized today. But if that makes sense for folks, I think that's probably the natural next step after we get past this one.
Sure. Sounds good.
So do we have a presentation scheduled for one of our calls from Attila?
We do, but I don't know if it's going to be the 15th or later. I know he was looking at March. So Joni, I think you're still on. Maybe we'll follow up and see if, or sorry, not the 15th is a Wednesday, duh. The 17th or the 31st.
Yeah, I figured that we would probably wait till after the projectathon at this point.
Yep. So that would likely fall on the 31st.
Okay.
Okay. Good to know.
Do you want to, Sheridan, do you want to reach out to Attila and just?
Yep, I'll just confirm.
I've got them the last few times, so.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. I'll stop sharing. And as always, I was a couple minutes late in the starting of the recording of this video, but it's uploaded on OwnCloud alongside our running working deck. So